Hello and welcome everyone to our Ask an Expert webinar. We are back and we are very excited to dive into this really important theme that's at the core of our work on modern childhood. This is the transformative power of including children in research and policymaking. I'm really pleased today to be joined by a fantastic group of speakers who will bring some deep insights into this topic, and I will introduce them shortly. But first, I would like to pass over to my colleague and co-moderator, David Frankel, to tell you a little bit more about how we will run today's webinar. David, over to you.
Thank you, Francesca. And firstly, great to be with you all today. And thank you to everyone for taking the time to join us and be part of the webinar. We're very excited to have you with us from all around the world. And we're looking very forward to an engaging and meaningful next hour of exchange and discussion. So before we begin, let me tell you a bit about the format. We'll start the presentation with my colleague Francesca to set the scene, followed by presentations from each of our panelists. After each panelist presentation, we'll ask a quick follow-up question. And after all the panelists have presented, we'll then move to an open Q&A session where you can pose questions to our panelists and engage in discussion on the topics raised in the webinar. So during the Q&A, I'll select questions from the chat and direct them to one of the panelists. In order to facilitate this process, please put your questions in the Zoom chat throughout the event, and you can direct them to specific speakers or the whole panel. Just please indicate when you're right. So now back to you, Francesca, to kick off the presentations.
Thanks so much, David. I hope that's clear for everyone. I'm joining you from the New Perspectives on Childhood project. And one of our big tasks at the moment is to look at how children can and do meaningfully participate in making decisions about things that are important to them. A few years ago, we asked our OECD countries, what does childhood participation mean? Why is this important to you? And we realized that education systems around the world are really exploring how to include children in decision-making processes. There's a lot of research to suggest that meaningful participation of children can contribute to a host of better outcomes. And one of the big questions we had was, how can education systems support child participation in decision-making? Something that we looked into was the rationale for child participation. Why should children participate? Not only is this a rights-based imperative, which is in the UNCRC, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, but there are a number of other reasons that give us reasons that show why we should encourage child participation. The first is that children enjoy it. There's a lot of research that suggests that children like to participate and that they tend to be eager and enthusiastic to participate in decision-making. Children tend to want to have a greater say on decisions that affect them. The other thing that I mentioned is upholding children's rights. The UNCRC outlines children's participation rights, including Article 12, which is the right to be heard on matters that affect them. The weight given to children's views will vary on things such as their age and their maturity. We know that child participation brings a host of policy and societal benefits. Participation can reinforce civic behaviors in children, and it can support their future political engagement. It can also promote social cohesion and contribute to policy outcomes that are tailored to children's needs. There are also benefits for education systems. Participation can promote a sense of belonging in learners, and it can help develop their self-esteem. It's also positively influencing school climate. Authentic forms of participation have been positively related to student well-being as well. A few years ago, we started looking at what can and what does child participation look like in different OECD education systems. And we know that there are a number of formal structures such as school councils and student advisory groups in many systems. Sometimes these are mandated by law, sometimes these are ad hoc in different schools. And this is a way in which students can voice their opinions and have an impact on school policies. Students are also often involved in different surveys or consultations. Oop, the lights turned off in here. And we know also that whole of school approaches that include students in identifying problems and finding solutions to those problems, as well as implementing the solutions, can be a great way to get students involved in different initiatives at school. Students can also be involved at the classroom level. asking students what interests them, or creating something like a course agreement together with students that they help implement in the classroom, and using this to craft lessons can support students. And creating this kind of safe space for them to lead and drive their own learning can help them foster their senses of agency and participate in classroom discussions. Who can support child participation? Teachers are key actors who can support participatory approaches. And we know that professional learning opportunities and resources can help implement successful programs. Coordinating and establishing overarching strategies for participation are really important, and this can ensure that approaches are not ad hoc and do not depend on individual school buy-in. Unfortunately, in many systems, we do see that that participatory approaches can either depend on individual teachers or individual school leaders. And we know one of the missing pieces is evaluating the impact of participatory approaches. We know that clearly and consistently evaluating these strategies is key moving forward. Improving the evidence base on what works and what works for who will improve both policy and practice. And with this, I would like to wrap up my quick intro, and we will get to our wonderful panel. Our first panelist who I would like to introduce is Lana Bowden. Lana is an associate professor in the Department of Child and Youth Studies at Stockholm University in Sweden. Her work advances methodological innovation in childhood studies, promoting research practices that prioritize children's agency and participation, and positioning them as co-creators in investigations that concern their lives. So Lana, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and hi everyone. And just some technical things about sharing the screen. Yes. So, yes, I'm an associate professor in child and youth studies at Stockholm University, and in this short presentation I will focus on children participation in research through a project I led on young children's participation in a large randomized control trial study in Swedish preschools, and the children were between 3 and 5 years old. And what was especially interesting about this project, it was that it included a number of different research methodologies and hence also a number of different ways of involving the children in research. Discussions focusing on children in research seem to emphasize how some methodological practices and ways of working with children tend to position children as objects, while other practices tend to position them as subjects and empower them. However, the children's own perspective and experiences of taking part of these different research methods has very seldomly been the focus. Still, the involvement of children in research is often discussed in scholarly work. What has become apparent in my work is how children's participation is discussed in relation to a number of prepositions that I guess some of you might be familiar with. Research that involves standardized tests are often described as research being done on children. Interview methodologies are described as being done with children, and explorative methodologies where children are understood as co-researchers are described as being done by children. Furthermore, research could be done about or to children, or maybe for children, focusing on the benefits of the research. What I have learned is that this way of discussing children in research is not a neutral way of describing their involvement. Instead, these prepositions are placed on what could be described as a value scale, where the more involved the children are in shaping the research, the closer the research is to be done with or by children, the better or more empowering the research is described to be. It can be described as a value scale from on to by, where the counting goes on, to, with, for, by, instead of the usual counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But what I find problematic is when already from the beginning assuming which research practices that are empowering and which aren't, I think that we might miss what involvement could actually entail. On the scale, many of the research practices that were performed in the randomized controlled trial study I was part of would be considered as research on children, less likely to take their involvement seriously, like the standardized tests and the EEG scannings that were performed. One of the things I wanted to investigate in the research project was the children's experiences of the EEG scans and the hats they wore during the scans. But rather than asking interview questions on how the children experienced the EEG hats or the scans, we together decided to make our own EEG hats, as you can see on these pictures. And this became a way to involve the children in investigating their experiences of wearing them and of participating in research. And this becomes extra interesting in relation to the value scale. It could be argued that the free reins and the play-like activities that I produced together with the children made it difficult for the young children to know what was expected of them, and maybe above all to be aware that they were part of a research project. So the standardized practices, on the other hand, in the test and the scan, might include children on a more transparent note where power relations between children and researcher become more visible and therefore easier to challenge. To conclude, children's involvement and empowerment in relation to specific research practices could be thought of in other ways, and research on a scale from bad to good needs to be problematized. What I do find as emergent issues that all researchers working with children, younger ones and older ones, no matter what area we are working in or what methodologies we engage with, we need to ask ourselves, how does this benefit children, the ones participating in the study, or other children that does not participate in this particular study? And maybe even more important, do we know anything about how the children themselves think about this? Through this, we might enable research projects that deals with research for children and engages with the norms, values, and ethical doings of children, the ones that the research formers concern and the ones indispensable for the research to be performed at all. So, thank you so much. And if you want to read more about what I have been talking about, I have just recently published a book together with my colleague, Professor Hilvi Lens-Taguchi. It's open access, and if you want me, I can put the link to the book in the chat afterwards. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Linnea. I think that would be excellent if you could share the link in the chat. That was a really, really interesting presentation. And I find it particularly interesting that you work also with young children, which we know tends to be quite a big gap in the child participation literature. I have one quick follow-up question. Do you find in working with younger children that there tend to be different barriers or roadblocks? And how would you recommend policymakers and researchers overcome some of these?
Well, I think that one way of doing it is, like I described, that you can work with practices that are already known to the children. Like I was doing this in the setting of a preschool, and then working with methodologies that they already are familiar with, and be very attentive to their own ways of saying no and yes to participating in research, to be aware of their constant consent to do the research. But at the same time, as I said, it might be an obstacle that these practices are very similar to what they are doing in their everyday work at preschools. So, and as a researcher, especially in relation to ethics, I think it's very important to be aware of not tricking them to thinking that they are part of something else than research.
Thank you so much. And I think mentioning that continued consent is critical in this space is really important. While children should have the right to participate, they should also have the right to not participate. It needs to be an informed choice. Thank you so much, Linnea. I will now introduce our next panelist, Ellie Craig, who is the chair of the Scottish Youth Parliament. She is also MSYP for Glasgow Cathcart. Sorry for my pronunciation. She also works with Young Scot and led SYP's The Right Way project, supporting meaningful youth engagement. So Ellie, with that, I give you the floor.
Thank you. I'll just share my slides. Okay. Can you see this and can you see my notes or?
We can see your notes.
Oh, okay. Let me see. I'm not sure how to do it. I think, David, if you could share the slides on your end instead, that would be really helpful. Just I'm not sure why it's not working because it was working earlier.
There we go.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so hi everybody. Francesca's already given me an introduction, so I won't take up my time doing that, but I'm really honoured to have been invited along today to tell you about the Scottish Youth Parliament and to share learning on how including children and young people in Scotland has really transformed the research and policy making that we have. Next slide, please. So firstly, to provide a bit of context, the Scottish Youth Parliament, or SYP for short, is a national charity representing all young people aged 12, 25 who live in Scotland. Our vision for Scotland is of a nation that actively listens to and values the meaningful participation of its young people. Our goal is to make this vision a reality in order to ensure young people in Scotland grow up loved, safe and respected and able to realise their full potential. SYP gives young people a platform to discuss the issues that are important to them. We exist to raise the voices of Scotland's young people to make sure decision makers listen to us and truly involve us meaningfully in making decisions that affect our lives. So SYP is made up of around 160 members of the Scottish Youth Parliament, MSYPs. These are 14 to 25-year-olds from every part of Scotland who have been elected by young people to represent their constituencies and to campaign for positive change. We're a very diverse parliament, one of the most diverse in the world if you compare us to our sort of older counterparts. For example, over half of our members identify as a girl or young woman, and 5 identify as non-binary. Nearly 1/4 of our members have a visible or invisible disability, and around 1/3 of MSYPs belong to a minority ethnic group. As a charity with human rights as one of our core values, we are passionate about making young people aware of their rights and making sure decision makers uphold these rights. For example, Article 12 of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, or UNCRC, is really fundamental to our work. And this article underpins all of the work that we do to campaign to uphold all of young people's rights in Scotland. Next slide, please. Although SYP has a small team of staff to support the work of MSYPs, SYP is entirely youth-led, which means all of the major decisions about what SYP does are made up by young people. For example, all MSYPs are involved in creating policy, deciding which issues SYP takes a position on and what happens in our campaigns. They're also involved in planning and leading consultations and research to find out young people's views, running workshops and meeting with elected representatives like MSPs and local councillors. 8 MSYPs on the screen here are elected each year to make up the Board of Trustees, which is responsible for making strategic decisions about what the organisation does. Next slide, please. So, since it started 25 years ago in 1999, one day before the Scottish Parliament, SYP has influenced lots of major changes on issues. For example, we've campaigned for free period products to be available to everyone in Scotland, for children to have equal protection from assault, for free music tuition, for mosquito devices to be banned, and for young carers to have access to more funding. Through our Votes at 16 campaign, MSYPs campaigned for 16 and 17-year-olds to be allowed to vote in all Scottish elections, but we haven't stopped there. We're really delighted that the UK government has recently announced an expansion of Votes at 16 from across the UK and is going to hope to deliver this by 2029. Our All Aboard campaign, which I'll touch on later, has led to the introduction of free bus travel for all young people under 22 who live in Scotland and the extension of free ferry travel for young people who live in island communities. So now on to my first case study, which is about our Right Here, Right Now campaign, which has led to Scotland incorporating the United Nations Convention of the Rights of the Child into Scots law. Next slide, please. So, with young people's human rights in the UNCRC framing in all of our work, it's only right that we played a key role in Scotland's journey to passing the UNCRC Incorporation Act Scotland last year. I'm sure many of you will know and be aware, but I think it's important to understand the significance of the step that Scotland has taken. So, in 1991, when the UK ratified the UNCRC, we signalled a commitment to children's rights. But incorporation goes a big step further and it brings the UNCRC into law, meaning that there's significantly more accountability for decision makers to uphold children's rights. Next slide, please. So, our 2017 campaign, Right Here, Right Now, was our first significant involvement in calling for incorporation into law. Since then, members of SYP have consulted young people in their area, written and met with elected politicians with the aim of reaching this point. For example, one MSYP told the Scottish Government in 2023 that they waited so long that the protections in the convention don't even apply to them anymore. So after all that work, we were so proud to see that the bill was voted in December of 2023. But the work doesn't stop here. Scotland is on a children and young people's rights journey, and that's a deliberate use of the word journey. Reaching incorporation only leads us to the next step on that journey, and this one is even more important, on implementation. UNCRC incorporation into domestic law only means anything if adults in power address the human rights issues affecting children and young people as a result, which is why we are focusing on creating a culture of human rights amongst decision makers in Scotland. One way we are doing this is through the Right Way project, a project run by SYP and funded by the Scottish Government's Children's Rights Unit. It aims to support and challenge officials and decision makers as duty bearers to work to ensure young people's Article 12 right is respected. Through this project, young people have designed and delivered training to public sector officials, senior civil servants, and created checklists and other resources for decision makers, and consulted with young people to find out more, not just about their opinion and decisions, but how they want to be involved in decision-making processes. Next slide, please. So, as you may know, the UNCRC is made up of 42 substantive rights that children and people have. But as I said previously, we have a unique relationship with Article 12, the right to be heard and taken seriously. We believe the only way that to uphold that right for young people is through meaningful participation in decision making. And it's essential because it's a right, not a gift or a favour for young people, but a right under the UNCRC. And the way to ensure this is fully realised is to meaningfully include young people in decision making from the earliest point possible in the process and throughout. And as the theme of this webinar, it also works. Meaningfully including young people in decision making leads to more inclusive and effective policies that better serve the needs of young people and wider society. It's really summed up by a member of the Scottish Youth Parliament who said, "Nothing about us without us," and that's a phrase that's been used wider, and it really does sum up that question. Next slide, please. So our case study. Ever since the year of 2017, members of the Scottish Youth Parliament have met with the First Minister and their Cabinet, along with the members of the Children's Parliament, for the annual Cabinet meeting of children and young people. This meeting gives children and young people the opportunity to bring some of the issues most important to them and their peers directly to the First Minister, Deputy First Minister, and Cabinet Secretaries. And this annual meeting is, as far as we know, the only one of its kind anywhere in the world. In March 22, the then First Minister Nicola Sturgeon said that the Scottish Youth Parliament do exceptional work in helping children and young people to confidently express their views and have a real influence on issues that matter most to them. This shows the real impact that involving children and young people in policy making can have. Alongside the annual Cabinet meeting, MSYPs have also attended the annual Executive meeting. It has less bells and whistles, but this meeting gives children and young people the opportunity to tell the most senior civil servants in Scotland, including the Permanent Secretary and Directors General, about issues affecting their lives. These meetings have led to real meaningful change. Since 2019, commitments made by the Scottish Government as a result of these meetings have led to more opportunities for young people's participation in decision making, the banning of mosquito devices in public places, the introduction of free bus travel for all children and young people aged 22 and under, and the incorporation of the UNCRC into Scottish legislation. Next slide, please. So the final case study I wanted to touch on, because I'm really aware of time, I could talk about this stuff for hours, is free bus travel for under 22s. So in 2018, MSYPs carried out a Scotland-wide consultation to find out about young people's experience of public transport. Over 1,000 young people filled in this survey and took part in focus groups to share their views. The results of this consultation were published in our All Aboard report, which made 10 recommendations to help improve young people's experience of public transport in Scotland. This was shared on social media, MSYPs wrote letters, gave presentations, and met with decision makers. So one of the recommendations was that the Transport Scotland and the Scottish Government should review existing concessionary fares. A group of MSIPs raised this recommendation at a meeting with the Cabinet, and the most senior politicians in the Scottish Government were there, and they agreed to carry out a review to look at extending these discounts to those under 26. So NSIPs and other young people helped with this review by taking part in workshops with Transport Scotland to make sure that young people's reviews at the centre of the decision making around this issue, and throughout the whole process from its initially being raised to then being implemented. And so this campaign was successful. So the under 22s free bus travel scheme began on the 31st of January 2022. And since then, Transport Scotland has reported that between January 2022 and April 2025, nearly 219 million journeys have been taken through this young person's free bus travel scheme, and it's shown to contribute towards the effort to reduce child poverty, widening young people's access to education and employment, enabling them to build and maintain relationships with friends and family members, and develop independence. Next slide, please. So I'm going to wrap up there, but I'm happy to answer any questions you have about our work. Thank you so much for inviting me along and listening to my presentation. I'm sorry that I did breeze through it. I'm aware I probably talked quite quickly, but I wanted to fit in as much as possible. So thank you very much.
Ellie, thank you. This was really informative. And I do have a quick follow-up question. You mentioned a number of initiatives where young people were involved and their input helped meaningfully change things. And I think it's really great to see. Something that a lot of participants asked us in their pre-webinar questions, the sort of buzzword among these questions was tokenism. So I wanted to ask, in your opinion, how can we avoid that the perspectives of young people are seen as tokenistic, or that young people, that their participation that it has meaning, that it holds weight?
Yeah, tokenism is a word that's come up a lot in all of our work. And of course, young people as a group is very political, and people tend to unfortunately use young people's views as a bit of a political football sometimes. There's loads of work to be done. I mean, the biggest one is on education. So that's why a big focus of our work has been on educating decision makers and those who are responsible for upholding participation rights, and what meaningful participation actually looks like and why it's important to practice it meaningfully. And it's also important that youth-led participation is not just putting young people into a space with a decision maker and sort of leaving them to it. It needs to be planned and supported by different charities and youth workers and adults who are sort of understand this process and can upskill young people and decision makers to be able to take part in the process meaningfully.
I think your point on educating decision makers and upskilling not just children, but the adults who are involved in these processes is essential, because the onus shouldn't be on children to have to learn the ropes, but it should also be on adults to learn the ropes on how to work meaningfully and effectively with young people.
Yeah, definitely not. And I'm aware of time, but we have an initiative where we deliver training to senior civil servants and adults and decision makers. And what we do is we make the adults play the children and young people, and the children and young people play the adults. And this is kind of a fake meeting to kind of let them feel what it's like to walk in children and young people's shoes. And it's been a really effective means of doing that, we found.
That's super interesting. Thank you so much, Ellie. And last but not least, I would like to introduce to you our third panelist, Dympna Devine. Dympna is a full professor of Education, Society, and Critical Childhood Studies in University College Dublin's School of Education. Her research centers on children's voices, rights, and equalities, with projects extending across the globe. So with that, Dympna, I pass the floor to you.
Thank you. Thank you. And thanks very much for the invitation to speak to this really important topic. How does including children transform research and policy making? So I'm just going to, let's see, can I move the slide? Okay. Animations don't work, that's okay. I just kind of wanted to locate maybe some of the work that I've been doing in this area for quite a long time before giving two kind of concrete examples of research that has had policy impact in terms of engaging directly with children and children's voices. Sorry, red light. Maybe that's it. I think the research and possibly everybody who's kind of tuning in today would be very familiar with the idea of children as competent, active agents. But I come to this very much from sociologies of education and sociologies of childhood, looking very much at how societal policies both promote and set boundaries to that agency. And again, in a lot of the work that I've done and the projects I've been involved in, and it was alluded to there in two of the previous presentations, what I would refer to as intergenerational power dynamics. In other words, the kind of dynamics of power and control between children as a distinct group in society and adults as a distinct group in society. And ultimately, who is it that decides what is good for children? There are certain kind of spaces within society or locales where those kind of power dynamics are particularly strong with respect to children and adults. And they are in the family, in the school, and the wider community. And that's kind of the three areas that a lot of the research that I've been involved in and with teams and the research that I'm going to talk to you about today as examples. And in many ways, we can consider this as kind of circular flows where you've got the societal structures and policies feed into those kind of key locales for children around family, school, and community. And they all impact on children's agency and children's voice. So we'll talk a little bit about that again when we come to the very end. The first project that I want to share with you is a project that we were involved in from 2017 to 2022, which was commissioned by Concern Worldwide, which is an Irish and an international NGO. And essentially, we were asked to evaluate a literacy, wellbeing, and gender equality intervention that was called Safe Learning. And this involved tracking how children were doing over 100 primary schools, 3,000 children for 3 years. And importantly, it was children who were in grades 1 to 3. So it was a younger age cohort. We tend not to have a huge amount of large scale research with children. And very importantly, this was in the rural communities within Northern Sierra Leone. I guess what was kind of unique about the research also was we built into it the mixed methods design, which involved case studies in 4 villages, 4 schools out of those 100, and working more intensively with children and their families within the extended community. And that was actually really important in terms of capturing children's voice in the everyday experience of their lives across those locales of family, home, and school community, and also really a deeper immersion into the socio-cultural context of the children's lives. Ultimately, our findings from that study was that when you improve directly girls' literacy, you actually improve their well-being. And I'm happy to talk about that later. And we have a website for that project where more information can be gained. But our key focus today is what was the impact on research and policy, and the importance of capturing children's voices and how children see the world was really reflected in this word brilliance, or cachemp in Temne, which was how children understood what education was about. It was about brilliance and making them brilliant. We also highlighted the importance of older siblings in children's literacy learning, which was something that really adults were not totally aware of, is the importance that older children actually did in caring for younger siblings and the impact positively that that had on their literacy learning in contexts where there wasn't a huge experience of formal education. There was a COVID-19, these projects took place during the COVID period. But we also had, if you like, impact in terms of policy, stakeholder and academic dissemination, but also real impact from the children's voices and experiences on government policies within Sierra Leone, particularly on issues to do with school safety, gender-based violence, and their policy of radical inclusion, which they had developed in 2021. And the study has impacted not only on the work of Concern, in terms of the countries that they've been working in around education, interventions and emergency education, but also other NGOs who've also drawn on the findings. A larger scale study, which was conducted within Ireland from 2018 to 2025, we're just coming to the final reporting of it, again tracked 4,000 primary school children over 5 years in 184 primary schools at really all over the island of Ireland. And again, you'll recognise the similarity in design in terms of we had case studies that were conducted in 12 of those schools, including 28 family studies. This was a more wide-ranging, comprehensive, in-depth analysis of all aspects of children's school lives in primary schools, focusing on those themes around equalities, well-being, school teaching and learning cultures, children's learning outcomes and their transitions in and out of the primary school systems, as well as their transitions across classes. And again, all of the details of that study are actually on the study website. So what has been the impact on research and policy? A core element of the Children's School Life study actually was, and it was funded by the National Council of Curriculum and Assessment in Ireland, was the development of an evidence base over time in relation to the primary school experience that prioritised children's voice. So that was a core focus of the Children's School Life study and the remit, if you like, of the funders, the NCCA. We facilitated that process through the establishment of children's research advisory groups in our case study schools that supported us in the design and evolution of the study as it evolved over time. In many ways, what the study has managed to do is to provide wide-ranging and in-depth understanding of how children experience their social worlds, which is very tied to that conceptualization of the study in terms of the socio-cultural dynamics that are involved in children's life worlds, and the insights into how this influences their learning across home and school, predominantly through, but not exclusively through, the children's voices. This study coincided, not by design, but by happening in terms of COVID-19. And we've issued 12 reports to date, which are really, really comprehensive in terms of children's voice on all aspects of their school experience, which is available on our website. The study is actually having a very direct impact on the reform of the primary school curriculum within Ireland. And also we've had wide-ranging dissemination with our key stakeholders, policy and academic dissemination. So I'm going to bring us back to the loop that I had at the start of the presentation, that really when you want to connect the theory in relation to children's everyday lives with research and with policy, it is around looking on children's voices as central to policy feedback loops. And this involves really disrupting traditional generational power dynamics. So if we look at our loops, we've got our policy reform, government, our NGO work, etc., feeds into the family, school and community, which are core institutions in children's everyday lives, feeds into children's voices and agencies. But then we also have children's voices and agencies through this kind of research, which is very policy oriented, feeding back in, capturing their voices through their experiences in the family, school and local communities, and then that in turn feeding back up into policy reform and, if you like, the influencers who make the decisions within the society, who are predominantly adults. So essentially what the essence of involving children within research is making the visible invisible and doing it in a way that is authentic to children's voices and experiences. What has been actually really important and a privilege actually for myself and research teams is longitudinal mixed methods research. You know, it's time in childhood is a really important part of capturing children's experiences. So we all know in terms of the very kind of tensions that are often there between focusing on the futurity of children, children as future becomings, but also the present being of childhood. What is it like to be a child in the here and now? But in knowing what it's like, we can actually plan for what it's going to be like for future children. So thinking about it in terms of feedback loops where children are at the heart of the voice in feeding into that feedback is actually an essential part of it. And we have lots of publications that are available across both studies. Happy to share those or the websites where you can get them on. And thank you very much. And there's my email if anybody would like to follow up after. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dympna. It's really interesting to hear about the two very different contexts in which you've worked. So thank you for sharing some of those insights. One quick follow-up question before we pass on to David. Did you follow up with children about how they felt about participating in these studies and what it meant to them to have their say, to express their agency?
I did, well, the team did, along with myself, Francesca, because these studies actually have involved spending time over prolonged periods of time with children over years. If I think about the most recent one, the Children's School Live study, we had been involved with the same groups of children over 5 years through fairly substantial part of their childhoods. And within the case study schools, we'd also been in touch with their families every year, even during the COVID period. So children were actually really sad that we were finishing up with them, and actually had, and I'm talking about particularly young children, wondered how they were now going to let the government know what they wanted to happen. Within Sierra Leone, in that project, again, we were involved with particular communities over a period of 4 years. And there were learning events that were hosted by Concern Worldwide and community stakeholders within key learning communities that children would have attended. So there would have been lots of discussions and follow on that. But certainly children really appreciated the sense of empowerment that they got actually from the study. And that's kind of an ethical issue over what happens after that.
That's really interesting. Thank you so much, Dympna. Without further ado, I see that we have questions streaming in. Please keep it up. We obviously have a very engaged and active audience today. David, please, can you start throwing questions to our wonderful panelists?
So thanks, Francesca. And firstly, thank you to the panelists for your guys' wonderful and insightful presentations. So we're going to kick off the Q&A. And so if you haven't already posed a question in the chat, please feel free to do so now and keep them coming throughout the Q&A. Also, before starting, I just want to say thanks to everyone who posted questions when they registered. We'll also weave those into the discussion today with our panel. So for our first question, a theme that came up very much in the chat today, as well as in the pre-registration question, was inclusion. So our first question is, how can we ensure broad representation when consulting children, whether it be for research or policy, including young children, children from disadvantaged backgrounds, or children with special needs, as well as the non-engaging young people whose voices might not be heard? And I'd like to pose this first question to Ellie to start.
Thanks, David. Yeah, that's a really important question, and it's something that we're really aware of because historically, the children and young people who have access to these decision-making spaces tend to be ones who are more privileged. But we've done a lot of work over the past sort of 25 years to really make sure that we're reaching young people from all walks of life from across Scotland. So, for example, we do a lot of work with national voluntary organisations in Scotland. So we have MSYPs who represent young carers, care experienced young people, and a variety of other organisations that represent young people who might face barriers to otherwise participating. And also something I think which is just really key to that is actually not just looking nationally, but making sure that there's supported youth voice structures in local communities and in local authorities and districts, because it's really important that the youth workers working with young people day to day in their communities, they have access to those young people and they're supporting young people who might not be in formal education. And so it needs to be a network approach and not just having one national representative group.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Ellie. I think so, like the key word, would you say, buzzword, is partnerships. You got to have partnerships to reach the broader kids.
Definitely. And going to where children and young people are and not expecting them to come to you.
Okay. And Dympna, Leanna, would you like to add anything to that?
No, I think Ellie has kind of captured it. I mean, I guess the studies that we've been involved in have been representative, and it's been really important that we have within the kind of sample of children that they represent all diversities of children. And that's actually really important. What you're talking here about is the challenge of hard to reach children or hard to reach communities. The project in Sierra Leone was very much within that because it was based in very rural areas, which are often very hard to reach. But it's also about methodologically, what are the methods that you use that ensure that all children are actually, being given the opportunity to voice their issues, because there can be a lot of group dynamics between children themselves, even when you do actually have children who are broadly represented from all kind of groups. So it's just something to be very mindful of and to build into your study design, and having your mixed methodologies, I think, is really, really important.
Yeah,
Thank you, Dympna.
I can just add something. and I saw that there was a question posted in the chat if the teachers were involved in the projects that we did in the Swedish preschools. And that was actually a key to the project being as successful as it was, because you need to have very, very strong and long collaboration with stakeholders for these projects to work. And especially when you engage with young people, because the ones knowing those young people are the preschool teachers. So we had a very close collaboration with the teachers and parents, of course. So.
It's great, Liana and Dympna, that you actually touch on that, because one of the questions that was coming through in the pre-registration questions from colleagues actually in Kenya and Vietnam were exactly about what are the effective methods to include children in research. And these professionals were actually in the health or science fields. So I was wondering, would either of you like to actually elaborate on that, about the methods you actually use in including them in your research?
Who are you addressing that one to, David?
You can start, Dympna, and then
Okay.
Liana can follow you.
I mean, and again, I know some people have been looking for, I'll put up the links again to the websites on the chat, but actually one of the methods that we have found very useful, and there was a question around differences in research in children in Sierra Leone and research in children in Ireland, and I have to say there are no differences. Children are children, and one of the methods that worked really well, both in Sierra Leone and in Ireland, but perhaps the difference between them was we used photo voice with children in both countries. And the children in rural Sierra Leone would not have been familiar with cameras, but it was just so amazing the way they worked with them and the kind of authenticity in the way they used them and talked about the photographs that they had taken in very similar ways to actually what we had in Ireland. We also, the study team, developed a board game around some of the questions that we were finding it very difficult to get the children to kind of respond to. And we worked with the children actually to develop a board game around that was fun, that was very interactive for the younger children. We're just actually publishing a paper on that in a special issue that's due to come out. So it's about kind of working with the children, working with the children's research advisory groups within the senior end of our primary schools. They had come up with suggestions, they interviewed each other, they prioritized what were the kind of questions that they wanted. So it's about being evolving and exploratory, which isn't always available to people in terms of funding and the resourcing to do a project that's authentically trying to grapple with the challenge of working with children. But there were some of the methodologies that we have found actually most effective for just the children leading in a way around the kind of responses that they're going to give.
That's awesome, Dympna. So also, I mean, key, you got to also make it fun. You got to get them engaged and make it fun, the research process.
And holding their attention, and children get tired and you have to respect that. And that's also about a kind of immersion and in their worlds and spending time with them, you know, and experiencing what it's like to be me in this situation.
Exactly.
Liana, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, just following up on what Dympna just said at the end, like remembering that you're entering the children's world and that they are the experts there, and try to work with what's already going on, because as Ellie also mentioned, that you have to reach out to them and not thinking that they will come to you, and then you have to understand that you are entering someone else's world and that you have to take care of that and treat them experts. We are sitting in an expert panel here today, but when we enter the children's world, they are the experts.
I think that's such an important point to touch on, and it's been coming up in a lot of our focus groups and chats with other experts. It's, you know, you can't have this arrogant adultism. You know, when you go into children's world, they know the best about their lives, and it's a key thing to always keep in mind. Our next question comes from Sonia from New Zealand, and she wanted to know, how do we protect diverse students' voices when they may not align with the expectations or beliefs of their families or communities. And I'd like to pose this to Ellie to start, and then I'll come back to you, Lana and Dympna.
Yeah, I think that actually good participation isn't just about allowing children and people to participate in the process, but it's about the education and the information that goes alongside that. So allowing children and young people to have their right to freely form their views probably comes before they can express them. And so that's allowing NGOs and in the school curriculum a political education and education on their rights, so that they are allowed to then form their views before they share them. I think it's a real challenge because of course children and young people are influenced by what goes on in their communities and online now and in their families. And actually there's so much information out there, and it's about making sure that we're providing really reliable information and teaching children and people those critical thinking skills so that they can form views which are well informed.
Thank you, Ellie. Dympna, would you like to add to that?
I totally agree. In many ways, the participation within the research can be an empowering thing when children feel it does make a difference. And the children in our studies wanted to know what was going to happen to what they were saying. And in fact, one of the things that we've done within the Children's School Life study consistently is to send back the reports every year to the participating schools, and we've developed child-friendly booklets and posters that kind of can be used by schools precisely around those kind of areas that Ellie has talked about, the kind of concerns that children have, what's children's own suggestions for how things can be improved. So that's kind of a very tangible impact. I think in my experience of communicating with every policymaker, every adult has been a child. And so when you have used the voices of children in an authentic way, you in many ways tap into what adults' own experiences were as children. And I have actually found that hugely powerful because it kind of resonates with the experiences for both adults and children. So while I have talked about power dynamics between adults and children, it doesn't always mean that that's a confrontational or disruptive. It's actually around shared experiences and shared communications. We had very challenging discussions in some of our communities in Sierra Leone around children's rights, because this was something that many adults, as would be the case in Ireland, would be concerned about in terms of usurping their authority as adults. So we had differences between children as well in their views on those. So we can't always assume that children are going to agree on what should happen in relation to those things. But what we did create was a space for conversation and for understanding where different people can come from in terms of perspectives around children's rights, issues around corporal punishment, all of those kind of issues were issues that we would have delved in, that you can't assume what children's views, that they're all going to be equal, but nonetheless, the research created a space for authentic engagement around that, and something that both adults and children could kind of identify with, and teachers, indeed, school leaders, etc.
Dympna, just following up on that, did you find that in this work in Sierra Leone, when you were able to take the adults within the community back to their childhood memories or back to their childhood experiences, did you find that was helpful in kind of breaking down maybe negative attitudes to including children in decision making?
Absolutely. I mean, it creates a space for that kind of engagement. I think the challenge is the follow-up, what happens after, as it follow through. And that was where, and again, I can't remember whether it was Linnea or Ellie who talked about, working, educating the policymakers, or within education, educating the educators. You kind of have to work with the adults and really disrupt some of their fear around some of this. So that's also often about tapping into their own experiences as children growing up, and that it's not perceived to be something that's threatening. So yeah, absolutely, I think it is helpful, but the sustainability of it is the issue, and that kind of connects into rights, and it's not something that does it always have to develop to be dependent on an advocate who's going to lead with it? Or is it something that becomes just part of the culture, the way we do things around here? And that's actually a real process that takes time and commitment.
Thank you, Dympna. I'm going to send Lana. Would you like to add anything to that?
Maybe to the first question, when working with very young children, what we try to remind the children all the time that was that we needed them to be able to do the research, that they were very important in helping us doing the research, and making them know their value in relation to us as researchers, and in relation to that, also being able to say that they don't want to participate, and being attentive to how different children express that.
Okay. And so, guys, we're coming to the end of the webinar. I'm going to give you one quick fire question to close off the Q&A. I'd like to start off with Lana, then we can go to Ellie and close off with Dympna. So the question is, what one action can policymakers or educators take today to embed meaningful child participation in their work?
Try to understand that we need children to, and we need to talk to children and listen in different ways on what they want us to know.
Thank you, Lana.
So practice our research and listening skills.
Okay. Thank you, Lana. And Ellie?
I think one thing we hear a lot policymakers say, and I find it really frustrating, is well, we need to listen to children and people, if we even get that far, of them saying that because they're the future. And actually, I hate that phrase, because children and young people are citizens in the community now. And so stop thinking about children and people as the future and start thinking of them as now and engage with them now. And you'll be really pleasantly surprised to see the impact that that can have.
I love that, Ellie. Dympna, you want to close off first?
Just, I think it's kind of, if you were to child-proof your policy, what would it look like? Because for me, child-proofing is if there was a child who was going through this, deciding whether it worked or not, how would it work? How would it fit? And again, having conducted a lot of ethnographic research with children, that's getting down and dirty into the everyday lives. That's where you really start to see it. So you escalate that up. It's about child proofing. It's how will a child actually experience this? And think of a child you know, are different children. We talked about representation and diversity and inclusiveness. Think of 3, 4 different kinds of children. If you were to child-proof what you're doing with respect to them, how will they experience it as children? And how will they experience it as different kinds of children?
Awesome, Dympna. So to close off, we got child-proofing, listening, and children are citizens now. Handing back to you, Francesca, to close off the webinar.
Thanks so much, David. A big thank you to our amazing panelists. We really appreciate you joining us today. Thank you so much to the audience for coming with your questions, with your comments. Please feel free to follow up with us after this webinar. If you have examples, interesting examples from your context of child participation, we would love to hear from you. And I would like to also extend a big thanks to our team, to the New Perspectives on Childhood team, for helping us out, tuning in today, and also to our communications colleagues. So thank you very much. Enjoy. In France, it's almost holiday time in August. So enjoy your summer to those of you in the Northern Hemisphere. And we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar in the fall. So thank you, everyone. Take care.